Alex O'Connor had the audacity to release a video called Why I'm Not a Christian just weeks before the celebration of the birth of baby Jesus. Listen, in this video, we're going to be tackling why Alex O'Connor is not a Christian. I've said it several times on this channel, and I'll repeat it now, that Alex is one of my favorite minds to actually interact with, merely because I consider him to be not only an honest seeker, but someone who I look up to for his ability to make his ideas felt, right? Even if, as in my case, they aren't entirely convincing. Alex starts this discussion with Dr. Trent Horn by going straight to the problem of suffering. Check this out.
These are amazing, but what also captivates me in the nature of our human experience is the depth of suffering to which we're all capable of sinking. I think that suffering in many ways defines the human experience, and certainly the experience of non-humans, such that I know people who will go their entire life saying that they've never really experienced any real pleasure. Their whole life has been a misery. But you'll never find a person who says that their entire life they haven't had any real pain and suffering. This is something that equally needs to be accounted for.
See what I mean about Alex? It's like his style that I appreciate. Like, he has this masterful ability to make his points relatable. Because we've all met those people, right, who claim to have only had very little pleasure in their lives. Like, I think the majority of blues songs written prior to the 60s were about that. And it's true that no matter how much pleasure someone has experienced in their lives, they're always acquainted with suffering. Even Siddhartha Gautama, who became Buddha, as the story suggests, lived in a palace where he was intentionally kept hidden from not only suffering, but any signs of suffering. Things such as death, sickness, aging, and still he feels impinged upon by the call of reality, like Neo in the Matrix. Ultimately, he sees suffering, experiences suffering, and establishes the Four Noble Truths, the first of which is dukkha, which essentially suggests that life is inherently imperfect, unstable, and marked by dissatisfaction and suffering. Then Alex goes on to suggest that religion, instead of preceding the problem of evil, as is commonly imagined, is in fact a response to it. Check this out.
And the book of Ecclesiastes ends with saying, this is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. That is, you have pages and pages and pages of nihilistic outcry. Somebody saying they just cannot understand why everything is so meaningless. They cannot live a meaningful life. They cannot find pleasure and joy in anything. And the conclusion of this is fear God and follow his commandments. It's kind of tacked on at the end there.
Damn, like, I feel like Alex almost caught it, but just barely missed it, right? The outcry of Lamentations, according to Alex, essentially is, I can't find pleasure or joy in anything. And the response is, you should abandon things as being reliable investments in your desire for fulfillment. We talk about it on this channel. I think it was a Rupert Spira intuition. He says, in what can I reliably invest my desire for fulfillment? It happens to not be any particular thing, but the abandonment of things. By suggesting that we should fear God and keep his commandments, the author isn't throwing in the towel and saying, shut up and dance, right? He's saying, after all your wayward wandering, collecting things and investing your desire for fulfillment in those shiny things, when you're finally exhausted of those futile efforts, then fear God and keep his commandments. To fear God essentially means to recognize that when placed against the background of who God is, I find myself small, finite, accountable. As a Christian mystic, I believe, as the scriptures proclaim, that man is fundamentally the breath of God, only temporarily experiencing the illusion of separation and becoming. But for those of you who aren't Christians, by the way, this is a worldview transcendent concept, right? The Vedic philosophies live by the creed Atman, right? Private self, is ultimately Brahman, which means all distinctions are Maya, or illusion, and that you, your friends, your family, and all your collective items are finally and ultimately Brahman, the whole thing. It's only when your naive journey collecting things is over that you begin your journey toward learning this truth, and that truth is the only thing that satisfies. Anyway, I think Alex misses the major point there, but then he asks this very important question.
Maybe animals do go to heaven after all, and it just kind of makes up for all the suffering that they're forced to undergo. I'm not going to say this is impossible, but But I'm going to ask you what you think is more plausibly the case if we assume either hypothesis. What would you expect to see? I don't think we'd expect to see anything like this if we assumed that there was a benevolent invigilator. But as I say, if we assume atheism, not only do we explain what we see in the world, but we also come to expect it. I think it's a much better account.
So here, Alex is saying that the suffering we see in the world should be more expected given atheism than given theism. I disagree, obviously, but for the following important reason. The reason atheism shouldn't predict suffering is because it fails to predict the prerequisite for suffering, namely consciousness. I don't believe it's controversial to say that whatever the atheist believes gave rise to the universe, it is definitely not a conscious being. And by being, I just mean isness, right? And expecting that a non-conscious thing or fluctuating non-conscious stuff results in consciousness is magical thinking. Here's the neuroscientist Sam Harris for more on that.
Chemicals bouncing around, but at a certain point of integration, at a certain point of encoding, the lights come on, right? If that's the way things work, those of us who are enamored of the hard problem would say it's always going to seem like a miracle, right? That's not understandable. That's the equivalent of saying before the Big Bang there was truly nothing, and then everything exploded into being. True unconsciousness, true nothing that it's like to be this system, is precisely the thing that can't give rise to the something of consciousness, right? And so it doesn't matter how you order it. It doesn't matter. It's not going to be intelligible.
So either we believe that magic happened, namely that the perfect amount of unconscious stuff did the sufficient amount of somersaults and cartwheels to produce something completely unrelated, or we submit to the ancient wisdom, which has a far more rational story, that consciousness is fundamental and tends to undergo processes of disintegration. To disintegrate means to no longer be whole. You've forgotten what you truly are, namely everything. Remember, Atman is Brahman. Adam is God breath. The reason religion has a better account of suffering isn't just because we can account for consciousness, even though that definitely helps though, but it's because we realize that we're called upon by our true identities, even as we journey far away from home. Look, here's an example. I used to love practicing accents, and once upon a time got pretty good at doing whatever this one is. This is, of course, no offense to Alex O'Connor, who I deeply respect. It's only to make the following point. Regardless of whether you think this accent is convincing or not is irrelevant. The point is that it feels slightly uncomfortable doing it. I'm pretending, and that pretending means that I'm being called upon subtly by my true American accent. It's as if it wants me to return to who I truly am. But imagine I not only kept this accent, but I perfected it, and say instead of stopping there, I began claiming that I was born and raised in cities in Europe I'd never truly visited. I might suddenly come to find myself lost in an identity I created for myself, beset with all the madness which accompanies the series of lies that I've chosen to live by. That's tough. That's the religious account of suffering, right? And I find it far simpler. But back to Alex. At this point, he leaves the problem of evil and goes into the problem of divine hiddenness. And I want you to pay special attention to the way he asks the question. Pay attention.
If there is a God who is good and wants to come to know us, then why is he so hidden from so many of us, so much of the time, even from those who so desperately seek his attention?
If there is a God who is good and wants to come to know us, why is he hidden? Pardon the paraphrase. But how could an omniscient being desire to come to know us? Did you catch that? How can I simultaneously be a being who knows everything and have the desire to know Alex? Something is off here. Either we're not talking about an omniscient God, or the question is malformed. If God exists, then God already knows Alex as well as Alex can possibly be known, hence omniscience. The problem is that Alex is imagining that meeting God should be like Romeo meeting Juliet, and instead it would actually be more like Romeo meeting William Shakespeare. Every page belongs to Shakespeare. even the scenes Romeo isn't in. And yet Shakespeare is hidden from Romeo's perspective. Though I haven't responded to the divine hiddenness problem as thoroughly as I would have liked, I'd like to reapproach it when the question is reformulated without the assumption that God desires to know things. Luckily for me, Alex reframes this and packages it in a nice, tight syllogism. Here it is.
Schellenberg formalizes the problem as saying, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving. If a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Non-resistant non-belief does occur. Therefore, it would follow that there is no God.
Got it. So, P1, if a loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. P2, non-resistant non-belief does occur. P3, a loving God does not exist. Fine. So I'd like to take that chunk of peanut butter that is that first premise and spread it thin across my toast. I want to inspect that first premise. It's always P1 that does the dirty work, isn't it? I think that Alex would allow me to restate his first premise thusly. If God were loving, he would sympathize with my search for truth concerning his existence, and he would endow me with the evidence I'm currently and earnestly lacking. Here's the problem with that assumption, though. God's benevolence cannot frustrate his omniscience. Let that sink in for a second. God's benevolence cannot frustrate his omniscience. What I mean by that is this. It is only by means of your ignorance that you see yourself as an abstraction, right? You see yourself as some thing, needing some other thing in order to achieve yet another thing.
If we then begin to explore what we essentially are, and in order to find what we essentially are, we remove everything from us that is not essential. The essence of anything is the aspect of that thing that cannot be removed from it. So if we remove from ourselves everything that is not essential to us, namely our thoughts, our images, our memories, our activities, our relationships, our feelings, what we end up with is not itself a thing. It is none of the things that we normally believe and feel ourselves to be. It is not a thought. It is not a feeling. It's not a sensation. It's not a perception. It's not an activity. It's not a relationship. So from this point of view, what we could say that what I essentially am is nothing objective. In that sense, in understanding, I am nothing. I am not a thing.
And you're asking, why won't God join me in that ignorant state of thinking and in that ignorant state of affairs? And I'm not using the word ignorant as a pejorative here. I mean ignoring. For instance, if you're paying attention to my words, you are ignoring background noises. Hence, my voice is foregrounded. It's not a pejorative. In asking God to give you this thing you're pretending to be, and give you this thing you're pretending to desire, you're asking for God to forego his omniscience, his recognition that you are not that thing, and guide you home from where you are. And ironically, there you are sitting in front of Trent Horn. You seem to have attracted the very thing you wanted. I should point this out. J.L. Schellenberg's definition of what constitutes a non-resistant non-believer, the word adequate is doing a ton of work there. Here are the characteristics of the non-resistant non-believer according to Schellenberg. Number 1, the non-resistant non-believer lacks belief in God. Fair, that's just a fact about him. Number 2, the non-resistant non-believer is capable of belief and relationship. Those are more facts, so those are fine. Those seem to be objective. Number 3, the non-resistant non-believer is not suppressing belief for moral, emotional, or volitional reasons. Fair. But here is the one that's doing the dirty work. The non-resistant non-believer is open, sincere, and willing to believe if given adequate reason. So either we can say that adequate reason is purely subjective, which would weaken Schellenberg's hiddenness argument significantly, or we can submit that by adequate evidence he means evidence which is sufficient for reasonable belief. evidence that is not easily defeated by counter-evidence. Now, Alex O'Connor, I think it's safe to say, would agree with me that there are arguments which are sufficient for reasonable belief, right? Meaning he doesn't believe that all religious people are unreasonable. I mean, he knows Dr. William Lane Craig personally and doesn't believe that he's an unreasonable guy. I mean, Craig is like the living proof that there are arguments for God's existence which are not easily defeated by counter-evidence.
First, let me say it's an honor to be here at Notre Dame, and I'm very happy to be debating Dr. Craig, the one Christian apologist who seems to have put the fear of God into many of my fellow atheists. I've actually gotten more than a few emails this week that more or less read, "Brother, please don't blow this." So you will be the judge.
If these two things are true, then it would seem to me that Alex O'Connor, by all reasonable standards, lands safely outside the category of non-resistant non-believer. Let me know in the comments where I'm off.